Now that we have both our auth block and splash screen set up, we want to set up navigation. So if our user is unauthenticated, we send them to the login screen. And if the user is authenticated, which means they're already logged in, then we send them to the navigation screen. In order to do this, we need to have a listener on our auth block in the splash screen. And based on the current auth block state, we can then take the appropriate navigation steps to send the user to the correct screen. Inside of the splash screen, we're going to wrap our scaffold widget inside of a block listener. Here we're going to type auth, and then we can import blocks.dart and import Flutter block. And then we can remove the const and put the const back down here. Now here, if I just try to print the state, hit save, we see that our simulator brings up an error about not being able to use the block listener because we never provided our auth block to our app. To provide our auth block, we need to go into our main.dart file, and we're going to provide the auth block above the material app. And this means we're going to be able to access the current state of our auth block anywhere in the app. Let's wrap our material app with a new widget called multi-repository provider and import Flutter block. Here we're going to add providers, which is a list of repository provider single child widgets. And the first repository provider we're going to add is a repository provider. Type to the auth repository. Create, we're not using context at all, auth repository. And now we're able to access our repository provider through context anywhere in the app. And we can do that by typing in context.read auth repository and then instantiating it. And as long as we call this line with the correct context after we provide the auth repository to our widget tree, then it should work. Now let's cut this out for now. And next we need to provide our auth block. So let's wrap our material app in a new widget called multi-block provider. And this takes in providers. And instead of a repository provider, we want to create a block provider. And this will be typed to an auth block. Create, we need the context. Instantiate the auth block. And here we have the auth repository that's required. And we can paste this line in to read our auth repository. Now let's save this, and we can hot restart the app, open up our terminal, and here we can see we have the auth state with no user, and the auth status is unauthenticated. Now let's go back to our splash screen, and inside the listener, we can check if the state.status is equal to authStatus.unauthenticated. And if it is, then we want to go to the login screen. Else if the status is authStatus.authenticated, then we want to go to the nav screen. Let's set both of those screens up right now. Inside of the screens folder, let's make a new directory called nav. And this will be navscreen.dart. And then we'll have login screen.dart. Inside of the screens barrel file, we'll export login screen.dart, and export navscreen.dart. Our login screen is a stateless widget called login screen. Import material. We'll change the container to a scaffold widget with body text, login screen, and this will be constant. We need to add a route name, so static const string route name, and set that equal to login. And then we need to create a route. So static route. And instead of doing a material page route, which would show the login screen sliding over our splash screen, we want to use a page route builder with a transition duration of 0 in order to make the screen appear on top of the splash screen. So let's return a page route builder. With the settings, const route settings, name route name, the transition duration, const duration, seconds 0. Page builder gives us back a build context, an animation double, and another animation double. And since we're not using any of this, we can just put underscores. So 1 underscore, 2 underscores, and then 3 underscores, so they have unique names. And then pass back the login screen. Let's do the same for our nav screen. So I'm going to copy this file, go to nav screen, paste it in, and then rename the login screen here to nav screen. Change the route name from login to nav, and change login screen down here to nav screen. Let's save that. And back in our splash screen, we can now do navigator.of context.pushNamed, and then the route will be login screen.route name, import screens.dart, copy this, and put it down here, change login screen to nav screen. And now if I save this and hot restart, we're going to see that we get the error route. And this is because we forgot to add it to our router. So let's go to our custom router, and inside onGenerateRoute, we can add the 2 cases for our login screen dot route name, return login screen dot route, and our nav screen dot route name, return nav screen dot route. Let's hit save, pop open the debug console, and hot restart. And here we have the root. We go to splash, and then we see login because the user is currently unauthenticated. And we also see the text login screen in the top left of our simulator. Now that our routes are set up properly, we should set up a way for our block to continuously print out to our debug console so they're easier to debug. Inside of blocks, we're going to add a new file called simple block observer.dart. And this is going to be a class, simple block observer, and extends block observer. And make sure you import Flutter block. If we go into block observer, we can see it's an interface for observing the behavior of block and qubit instances. And we haven't looked at qubits yet, but we'll do so shortly. And they're basically blocks, just without the events. Instead, you're calling methods directly on the block to yield states. Here we can see we have different methods here like onEvent, onTransition, and onError, all of which we're going to override so we can print out to our debug console. So we're going to write override void onEvent. This takes in a block, and object event. And here we can print out the event. And then we need to call super onEvent block event. Next up, we need to override onTransition block transition print transition super.onTransition, and then finally we have onError void onError qubit object, and then the stack trace. And this one will actually be asynchronous because we should be returning a future void. Print object super.onError qubit error stack trace. And so let's actually rename the object here to error. And now our simple block observer is all done. onEvent is going to fire whenever a new event is added to any block. OnTransition is when a block is changing from one state to another state. And then onError is when any error is thrown inside of our block or qubit. To utilize this file, we need to go into our main function up here and write block.observer and just set it equal to simple block observer. Hit save, hot restart the app, and now we see our auth block is being printed out to our console. So here we can see the event auth user changed is fired, it's sent to our block, and our block is updated from the state auth state with an auth status of unknown, and then the event happens, which then causes our map event to state to fire, and our state remains the same because the user is unauthenticated. So event.user is null here, and authState.unauthenticated is yielded. Then we go to our login screen, because inside the splash screen, we have a listener on our auth block, and the state.status is unauthenticated, which means we're going to the login screen, and we can see the route changes right here. Now that we finished our basic splash screen routing, we can get started on working on the login and signup screens.